It's hard to believe that the relationship between MIT and EPIC is 30 years old. I vividly recall being called in by Bob McCursey and asked to help figure out how to deliver value to EPIC after Paul and Lester had set up this great relationship. It's been wonderful for me. It's provided a ringside window on a fascinating economy, on a fascinating set of companies for the whole period. And I believe we've also provided a fascinating window on technologies and markets at MIT. Those of you who have heard me before probably know that I can't get by without some pictures. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the themes that I addressed over the last 20 years when I've been going back and forth to Taiwan. The first slide that I have to show is just a discussion of Taiwan's positioning. I recall when we started in the late 1990s, Taiwan was very much worried about how to get out of the corner of being a low value-added assembler into being a technology designer, provider, orchestrator. How does it move up the value chain, both in technologies, but also particularly in organizational complexity? And looking back over the 30 years, it's clear you've been very successful in doing that. Our discussion, the next slide shows, was typically on the competitive advantages and the competitive positioning of Taiwan. And at that time, I was using Michael Porter's diamond as the key mechanism for orienting this. So you have the demand conditions, the factor conditions, the related and supporting conditions. And at that point, Taiwan had quite a unique positioning in that it was connected with the markets of the West, but it was also connected with the factor conditions of the mainland as well as Taiwan. And it had substantial supply chain capabilities, substantial orchestration capabilities. Over the years, we talked about how Taiwan, through its policy choices, might influence its competitiveness in an area that I like to emphasize, and I hope is still of emphasis, is the whole area of the transition to clean energy. Taiwan, of course, is a digitally advanced nation. It's also a nation that's highly dependent on imported energy. Therefore, it has a great deal of risk exposure. And it's always struck me that if Taiwan were to adopt a set of policies that called for very clean energy, very resilient energy, highly digitized energy system, it could in fact create at home the demand conditions that would lead much of the world. And I still believe that. So how do you make your policy choices not only to make it a useful market for the citizens of Taiwan, but also to make sure that the products that are wanted in Taiwan are the products that are wanted in the world, ideally the products that are wanted in the world 2 years from now? How do you make it an advanced set of demand conditions? And that's been an interesting discussion over time. I think, you know, Taiwan, one can say it's in a difficult position where it's poised between the East and the West, but it's also a very rich position poised between the East and the West. It's intimately connected with the technologies and markets of the West. It's intimately connected with the technologies, markets, and supply chains of the East. It is, using Lester Throw's word, it's kind of a piece of gravel that's caught between the tectonic plates. So it's likely to be an extremely moving and dynamic situation, but one that could be a great deal of technological advantage. Over time, my focus turned from how do you tweak the competitiveness of the nation, much more to how do you improve the competitiveness of firms. And there I focused on the capabilities of the firms. Here I'm presenting the capabilities pyramid. The usual capabilities are, if you use a cooking analogy, knowing how to prepare individual ingredients. You know how to chop onions, you know how to do various things. That's kind of the basic level. The next level is the ability to follow a recipe, which would be kind of the ordinary capabilities. But what really matters and what really differentiates a company or a country or a place is the ability to create a recipe that will be followed by others. So if you think about large systems, digital information systems, electrical systems, etc., creating recipes that work in those situations really matter. And if you focus on the abilities to create recipes, then you need to think about what is the mechanism for curating those capabilities and growing them over time. And a key framework that I introduced and talked about many times in my visits to Taiwan was the rat and cat framework, where in the next slide, the rat basically says, the capabilities you develop at home are useful to you internationally, in particular if they're relevant to the other markets, if they are appropriable by you, and if they can be transferred to other markets. The relevant point is particularly interesting for Taiwan, because as a small nation with a fairly integrated policy system, it can tweak its own conditions so that what happens at home is relevant in other places. In many ways, you might see Taiwan as a little bit like Finland was early on in the digital age when Nokia emerged as a lead firm. It emerged as a lead firm in part because it followed both the European and US standards and was able to work both. It was not trapped by either. One could imagine Taiwan in a very similar position of being able to cross that boundary of being both open to the West, open to the East, operating there. And of course, very much linked to the EPIC companies coming to MIT, how do you capture new capabilities, which I talk about in terms of cats? Next slide. How do you find new business recipes, new ways of doing things that are common practices in other locations that you might incorporate, that are complementary to the way you do things, and again, that you can appropriate, that again, you can retransfer to other locations. And through that, over time, a company can build a dynamic system. So over this, let's say, 20, 30-year discussion, we've talked continuously about competitiveness of the nation. We've talked a great deal about the competitiveness of the firm. I have enjoyed watching the firms grow up, become world leaders. I've also very much enjoyed watching Taiwan itself grow as a political entity. And I think one of the outstanding advantages you have now is the combination of digital and democracy. Digital democracy, you are probably the leaders in the world. We know that in much of the East we have highly digitized systems, but not democracy. Here, at least in the United States, we're still fighting with paper ballots. So there's a very interesting set of institutional conditions that I think can form the base for products, business models, way of life going forward. I wish I were 47 years old and starting another 30 years. It would be a fascinating journey along with you in Taiwan. Thank you very much for a great relationship.